one of my most poignant memories of my father was when I was 14 years old when he died, and we waked him at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, and we brought him down to Washington, D.C., and I was on this train ride that should have been a 2-hour train ride that I've made many times. It took 7.5 hours because there was 1 million people on the train tracks. And I watched, these huge crowds and it was a cross-section of America. There was black people and there was white people. There was nuns and there was rabbis and there was hippies and there were people in military uniforms and there was young people and old people, and they were holding signs that, American flags and signs that said, "Goodbye, Bobby," and people singing the battle hymn of the Republic that you could hear the whole way down to Washington, D.C. And then, we brought him we got to Washington, and we brought him past in a convoy up to Arlington. We passed the mall in Washington, and Martin Luther King and my father had organized a Poor People's Campaign. Martin Luther King had died a couple of months before, but before that they had organized a march on Washington, and so there was thousands of poor people living on shanties in the mall in Washington, these little plastic, paper plastic shacks and stuff, and they all came to the sidewalk as we passed, and they bowed their heads and held their hats against their chests, and they bowed their heads as we went up to Arlington to bury my father next to his brother. But I remember the faces in that crowd, and it's the same faces that I saw when I was, throughout all of these campaigns when I was growing up, and it was a cross-section of America. And then 4 years later, I was going to Harvard, and I was studying history, and I saw at that time demographic data, polling data, that showed that those white people who were lining the train tracks 10 rows deep, between Baltimore and Washington, throughout Maryland, who had voted overwhelmingly in the Democratic primaries in 1968 to support my father. And in 1972, 4 years later, the vast majority of them voted not for George McGovern, but for George Wallace, who was diametrically opposed to everything my father believed in. And it occurred to me then, and it struck me many, many times since then, that every nation, like every individual, has a darker side and a lighter side, and that the easiest thing for a political leader to do is to appeal to our greed and to our bigotry and to our self-interest and to our hatred and to our personal interests. We don't want to pay taxes. We don't want to be part of a community. We want to just do things for ourselves, and our xenophobia and all these, the darkest portals of the human character. And that the much more difficult thing to do, and it's what my father tried to do, and what all of these political leaders in this room, what Judy and Bruce are trying to do, and Gail and Terrence and Betty and all the other people, is to do something much, much more difficult, which is to get people to transcend their narrow self-interest and see themselves as part of a community.